They took my kids, said it was for safety. But when I knocked on their door, calm, quiet, they had no idea they'd just crossed a federal judge, or that justice was already on its way. It was supposed to be a quiet summer. After nearly 3 decades on the bench, dealing with everything from organized crime syndicates to corporate corruption cases, I finally stepped away. Not forever, just long enough to breathe. My name is David Caldwell. Most people just know me as Your Honor. But this summer I just wanted to be dad. A father to 2 beautiful kids, Ellie and Max, ages 9 and 11. After their mother passed 2 years ago, things hadn't been easy. I'd buried myself in my work, thinking the courtroom was where I was most needed. But watching the light fade from my daughter's smile and the silence grow between me and my son taught me something the law never could. Justice starts at home. So I took a sabbatical and rented us a house in what looked like a dream neighborhood just outside Denver. It was a quiet, upscale community, nestled against a backdrop of pines and low mountains. Gated entry, manicured lawns, a small playground, tucked behind the tennis courts. Safe, clean, quiet. That was the promise. The kind of place where fathers wave to each other while grilling in the backyard, and where kids leave their bikes on the driveway because nobody worries about them being stolen. The neighbors were polite, if a little stiff. Lots of retirees. A few young families, some military men, a dentist 2 doors down. The HOA sent out regular emails about lawn maintenance, paint color guidelines, and pool rules. Nothing unusual. But from day one, there was this subtle pressure in the air, like you'd stepped into a neighborhood-sized performance where everyone was playing the role of the perfect resident, but no one dared breathe too loudly. That kind of tight. Control might not bother some folks, but as a judge who's seen what power does to people when it's unchecked, I paid attention. The HOA president, Sharon Greaves, was hard to miss. Early 60s, sharp haircut, lipstick always a little too bright, and a clipboard seemingly glued to her hand. She introduced herself the day we moved in. Her smile stretched wide, but it never touched her eyes. "We take pride in our community. Standards," she said, standing at the edge of our lawn like she was inspecting the property. "And I'm sure you'll fit right in, Mr. Caldwell." I didn't mention my job. I've learned that once people find out what I do for a living, they either get defensive or overly polite, and both are exhausting. I told her I was here to spend time with my kids, nothing more. She nodded, but I could see the wheels turning. From that moment on, I felt watched. It wasn't overt, not yet, but small things stood out. The way she paused a little too long when driving by our house. The way another board member, Jeff, I think, casually mentioned at a block barbecue that Sharon really values order. Still, I let it go. I wasn't here to fight battles. I was here to reconnect with my family, to teach Max how to cast a fishing line, to let Ellie pick wildflowers and paint them on her little canvas, to sit on the porch in the evenings reading books out loud like we used to. For a few weeks, that's exactly what we did. We explored local trails, roasted marshmallows in the backyard fire pit, and even hosted our own movie night with a sheet hung across the garage. The kids smiled more, laughed more. The shadows I'd seen in their eyes since the funeral started to lift. And for the first time in what felt like years, I started to feel like a whole man again. Not just a judge, not just a widower, just dad. That's when the notices started. At first, they were almost laughable. Reminder, lawn height must not exceed 3 inches. Fine. I cut the grass again, even though it looked immaculate. Then came, warning, bikes must be stored in garage when not in use. Ellie and Max had left them beside the porch for an hour while we had lunch. Next was a note about excessive noise, the noise being the kids playing tag in the front yard at 5 in the afternoon. I started replying to these notices, politely but firmly, asking for specific citations from the HOA guidelines. I received vague responses and once, no response at all. I reminded myself that I wasn't here to stir trouble. My kids were safe. We were together. And a few bureaucratic rules weren't going to ruin that. But something deeper bothered me, something hard to explain. An undercurrent of control disguised as order. That's the thing about power. The petty kind is the most dangerous. because it operates quietly, smugly, and with the assumption that no one will challenge it. Sharon wasn't just running a neighborhood committee. She was orchestrating a stage play where she got to decide who was the hero, who was the villain, and who didn't belong. And while some men might have brushed it off, looked the other way, or tried to blend in, I've seen firsthand what happens when people like her go unchecked. They push, test boundaries, and once they think no one will stop them, they cross lines they can't uncross. And if this story resonates with you, even just a little, because you've lived long enough to know what it feels like to have your dignity stepped on, to watch someone misuse power and smile while doing it, then I want you to stick with me. If you're a father, a grandfather, a man who's worked his whole life trying to do things the right way, the honest way, only to be met with disrespect or injustice, you're not alone. These stories I share here aren't about drama. They're about truth. Real men, real lives, and real moments where standing up matters. So if you value that, I invite you to subscribe, not for the views, not for the numbers, but because you believe in something greater than silence. Because sometimes the quiet man in the corner is the one you never should have underestimated. The kids were playing chalk games on the driveway, one afternoon laughing carefree, when a woman from the HOA walked right up to Ellie, looked her in the eyes and said, "You don't belong here." It started with a notice taped to the front door, bold red letters typed out like an eviction threat. Violation number 17, children riding bikes on the sidewalk. My first reaction was disbelief. Ellie and Max, the two most rule-abiding, soft-spoken kids I'd ever known? I pictured them laughing and riding their bikes in a slow circle, always checking both ways, helmets snug, waving at the occasional neighbor. If there was ever a model for respectful childhood, it was them. I shook my head, assuming it was a mistake or just an overzealous HOA rule meant to keep teenagers from racing each other recklessly. I even smiled a little, figuring it was one of those absurd things I'd one day laugh about with the kids. I took the notice down, filed a formal reply through the HOA's official channel, and thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Over the next week, 3 more notices arrived, each more ridiculous than the last. Unapproved lawn decorations, which turned out to be a small ceramic gnome Ellie had picked out at a weekend market. Garage door left open, despite the fact I had installed an automatic timer that shut it precisely 10 minutes after use. Unauthorized use of community pool. We had a pool pass, issued and signed by Sharon herself. Each time I responded with calm, written statements and attached supporting evidence when possible. I cited HOA bylaws. I referenced their own guidelines. I kept it measured, professional, courteous. But what I didn't know then was that logic wasn't the language Sharon Greaves spoke. Her world ran on power and perception. And when you start making her look foolish on paper, she responds by trying to make you look like a problem in public. The tone shifted after that, subtle at first. Neighbors who had previously waved stopped making eye contact. A man across the street who used to smile while watering his roses now closed his garage door the second we stepped outside. The board members, once neutral, now looked at me with thin-lipped disapproval whenever I showed up at community meetings. And still, I tried to be patient. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. People didn't know the full story. Once they saw the truth, things would settle down. But that belief began to crack the night Ellie came home from the park, eyes red, fists clenched around the strap of her backpack. "She said I can't play there anymore," she mumbled. I crouched down, trying to stay calm. "Who said that? Honey?" Her voice trembled as she described a woman, late 50s, dark sunglasses, clipboard in hand, who walked right up to her and Max while they were playing and told them, "This area is for residents' children only. You two aren't on the list." Max stood beside her, jaw tight. He didn't say much, but the look in his eyes, confused, betrayed, like the world had just gotten colder, hit me harder than any courtroom cross-examination ever had. My children had never faced that kind of exclusion before. They'd been through loss, yes, but never this kind of personal, targeted rejection. That night, I stood on the porch long after the kids went to bed, staring out into the clean, quiet street that suddenly didn't feel safe anymore. And then I made a choice. I walked down the road, up the path to Sharon Greaves's porch, and knocked. She opened the door with the kind of smile that makes a man's skin crawl, tight, smug, knowing. "David Caldwell," she said without me introducing myself. "From Lot 43." Her tone made it sound like I was a trespasser on her land. I kept my voice even. "I'm here because my kids were told they can't use the park. I'd like to know why." Her response was almost immediate, like she'd rehearsed it. "We have rules, and some people think they're above them." I raised an eyebrow. Above them? My children don't follow the guidelines, just like their father. She smiled again, this time with her eyes narrowed. "You think being polite gives you a pass? It doesn't. Everyone notices when someone doesn't fit in." That word, fit, stuck with me. I'd prosecuted men who'd stolen millions, some who'd taken lives, others who'd bent entire systems around their egos, and I'd seen them all crumble when confronted with truth. But nothing stung quite like hearing that someone believed my family didn't fit in a neighborhood because we didn't bow to arbitrary power. I left without raising my voice, without threatening, without even mentioning what I did for a living. I wanted to believe that reason might still win, that decency would still count for something. But the next morning, another notice appeared, this time labeled Final Warning. And this one was different. It wasn't about lawn gnomes or pool passes. It stated that my continued non-compliance could result in a community review, a term I'd never seen in the bylaws. That's when I started digging. I spent the afternoon reading every line of the HOA charter. I cross-referenced meeting notes. I pulled email threads, and what I found was subtle but dangerous. A pattern of informal enforcement, rules that weren't written down but had still been applied by Sharon's board. I found cases where other families, mostly newer residents, or those who didn't socialize at the HOA events, had received similar warnings. And I found the kicker. Sharon had discretionary authority to restrict access to community spaces for repeated violators, even without a formal vote. It was a loophole, a poison seed buried in the soil of every perfect community, ready to bloom if no one noticed. I might have been able to swallow all that, to let it go for the sake of peace. But that night, as I tucked Ellie into bed, she whispered something that stopped my heart. "Daddy, if they don't want us here, do we have to leave again?" That word, again, hit hard. She remembered every move we made after her mother died. Every apartment, every goodbye, every time she had to start over. And now she thought that this time, too, we'd just pack up and disappear because someone didn't like the way we lived. I kissed her forehead and promised we weren't going anywhere. I told her we had just as much right to be here as anyone else. But as I walked down the hallway, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a petty HOA president. I was dealing with someone who'd built a system around herself, designed to crush anyone who didn't fall in line. And worse, she wasn't just going after me, she was going after my children, and the next morning both Ellie and Max were gone. It was one of those perfect summer mornings you try to remember forever. Blue skies, the smell of maple syrup on the stove, and the sound of your children's laughter echoing off the pavement. I was flipping pancakes while Ellie and Max played, in the front yard, their bikes tracing lazy loops on the sidewalk. I stepped inside for just a moment to grab the syrup. Just 60 seconds, maybe less. When I came back out, everything was still. No giggles, no bouncing basketball, no flash of blue from Max's helmet or Ellie's pink sneakers. I blinked, assuming they'd gone around the side yard or were just playing hide and seek. But after 5 minutes of calling out, checking the backyard, the side alleys, the cul-de-sac, nothing. Panic has a taste, and it hit the back of my throat like copper. I ran to the neighbors, knocked on doors, scanned every yard, every porch. Still nothing. I was 30 minutes into my frantic search when my phone rang. It was Sharon. Her voice was calm, pleasant even. "David," she said, "your children are being kept safe. We had to take action before someone got hurt. They'll..." Be released after a behavioral review. My ears rang. I couldn't even speak for a second. Did she just say behavioral review? Like they were property? Like she had a right to take them? I asked where they were. She refused to answer. Said it was classified under neighborhood safety protocol. She sounded so casual, like this was just another HOA citation, not a kidnapping. I hung up and drove straight to the community clubhouse. The doors were locked. The windows were covered with blackout blinds. I banged on the glass, shouting their names, then backed up and called the police. The dispatcher asked if I had a custody battle going on or any known threats. I said no, but then I added something I hadn't told anyone in this neighborhood until now. You may want to flag this, I said. I'm a sitting federal judge. This is about to become a national headline. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then she said, units are en route. 15 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up to the front gate of the community. I met them at the entrance, breathless, voice cracking, every second ticking, by like a drop of acid. Sharon stood by the gate, HOA bylaws clutched in one hand, her chin high like a queen defending her throne. She tried to argue with the officers, claimed her position on the board allowed her to enforce residential safety measures. One of the officers asked bluntly, "Are you admitting you've detained 2 minors without parental consent?" She faltered, tried to spin it into supervised holding, said she'd called a behavioral counselor, someone on the HOA payroll, no doubt. But no amount of board jargon could change what had happened. The officers pushed past her, and we entered the clubhouse. I'll never forget the sound of Ellie's cry the moment she saw me, or how Max ran straight into my arms like he was escaping a nightmare. They were seated inside a small, windowless conference room, huddled on metal folding chairs, with juice boxes and a clipboard on the table, like they were in some twisted version of daycare. Both were unharmed physically, but you could see it. In their eyes. They didn't understand why they'd been taken away, why adults they didn't know had told them they were being corrected for their own safety. I held them both, promising over and over that they were safe now, that they'd never be taken again. The officers asked Sharon to step outside. She argued, refused to hand over any documentation, claimed I was escalating things. One of the officers turned to her and said, "Ma'am, this is now an incident of unlawful detention." She blinked, confused, still clinging to her HOA identity like it would somehow shield her from consequences. That's when I stopped being David from Lot 43. I wasn't just a tired father on sabbatical. I stood up, stepped into the room where the officers were writing their report, and calmly said, "I need you to document everything. Every minute of detainment. Every false claim. Every denial of access." They looked at me, eyes widening as I pulled my ID from my wallet. The one I used in federal courtrooms, not neighborhood meetings. The tone shifted instantly. This was no longer a local complaint. It was a legal breach of liberty. It was an abuse of authority. And more importantly, it was personal. Sharon, seeing the officers now treat me with a different kind of respect, stammered that it was all a misunderstanding. She claimed the kids were loitering unsupervised. I asked her to point out the policy in the HOA charter that gave her the right to remove children from their own front yard. She couldn't. Because it didn't exist. The HOA guidelines, as I'd already learned in detail, offered no such authority. Her actions weren't based on rules. They were based on resentment, on a twisted sense of power, and on the belief that she could humiliate me by controlling the only thing I cared about more than anything. My kids. But she had underestimated me, not just because of my profession, but because of who I am when pushed too far. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I filed. By Monday morning, I had submitted formal complaints to the city, contacted a constitutional attorney, and placed a call to a local investigative journalist who had once covered a wrongful eviction scandal tied to HOA overreach. I wasn't after revenge. I was after accountability. I contacted every neighbor I'd spoken to during those early days when we were still new to the community, and I asked them one question. Have you ever been silenced or threatened by the board? The stories came flooding in. Quiet retiree, couples fined for garden gnomes. A single mother barred from pool access. a young veteran accused of violating noise ordinances for mowing his lawn after 6 p.m. It wasn't just us. Sharon had been operating her fiefdom for years, and most people were too afraid or too exhausted to fight back. But when people saw someone else stand up, someone who could speak in court, who understood the system, they started to believe they could push back too. Within a week, a special meeting was called. Sharon tried to cancel it, claimed it wasn't on the calendar. But I knew the bylaws better than she did by then. I quoted the clause that allowed for an emergency vote if 1/3 of the residents demanded it. We got nearly half. The meeting room was packed. Faces I hadn't seen in weeks. People who once avoided eye contact now stood shoulder to shoulder. One by one, residents told their stories. Then I stood up, held up the printed report from the police, and read the words, "Unlawful detention of minors." I looked directly at Sharon. You didn't just break rules. You crossed a line that no position, no title, no committee ever grants. She tried to speak, but no one was listening anymore. And just when it seemed like she might resign quietly, she said something that made the entire room fall into stunned silence. You people never belonged here to begin with. The morning sun hadn't even warmed the pavement when I pulled into the HOA clubhouse parking lot, but the air was already electric with something heavier than heat: accountability. This wasn't just another resident complaint or neighborhood squabble. This was reckoning. I stepped out of my car not in jeans and a polo like every other board meeting attendee, but in my official black judicial robe and badge clipped squarely to my chest. I wasn't there for theater. I was there for clarity, for gravity, for every person who had ever been silenced behind white picket fences and HOA guidelines weaponized by petty power. As I walked toward the building, I noticed blinds shift behind windows. Whispers carried from porch to porch like the first wind of a coming storm. By the time I opened the door, the room was already packed. Residents filled folding chairs, some standing along the walls, others hovering near the back, arms crossed with a look I recognized instantly: quiet hope. The board members sat behind a long table, suddenly much smaller than they had seemed weeks ago. Sharon was in her usual seat at the center, but her shoulders were stiffer now, her eyes darting nervously as I approached. I placed a thick packet of documents on the table in front of them, sealed, numbered, and legally binding. "I am David W. Caldwell," I began, my voice calm, unwavering, carrying across the room with the weight of decades in federal courtrooms. United States District Judge and father of 2 minors who were unlawfully detained by this board. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw Sharon's breath hitch, her lips part, as if to respond, but no words came. I looked each board member in the eye as I laid out the charges: false imprisonment, child endangerment, impersonation of authority, civil harassment, and a pending audit into the HOA's financial activities, including misuse of community funds and systematic abuse of power under the guise of safety. "You are not law enforcement," I said. "You are not above the Constitution. What happened to my children was not just immoral, it was criminal." Sharon finally spoke, her voice cracking. She said she meant well, that she was only doing what she thought was necessary to maintain community standards. I let her finish. Then I asked her one question. "Do you think this is how safety is enforced in a lawful society? By terrorizing children and silencing families?" She stared at her hands. Her silence spoke more than any apology ever could. The board looked at each other. Then, without hesitation, a motion was made and seconded. A vote was held. Every hand, except Sharon's, went up to remove her from the presidency, effective immediately. She tried to protest, citing procedural issues, claiming the meeting was out of order. But I calmly reminded her that I had already filed preliminary motions in district court, and that her time for procedural games was over. That meeting was the beginning of a tidal wave. Over the next several weeks, more residents came forward. Dozens of them. One man, a disabled veteran, shared how Sharon fined him for having a flag displayed too early on Memorial Day. A widowed grandmother explained how she was threatened with eviction over her rose garden. Young families revealed how playsets were forcibly removed from their yards under the claim of visual disharmony. My longtime friend and constitutional attorney, Marcus Reyes, joined the cause pro bono, and together we built a civil case that unraveled years of abuse. We subpoenaed financial records, uncovered personal vendettas dressed up as policy, and traced community funds funneled into private consulting firms tied to Sharon's extended family. The deeper we dug, the uglier it got. But something else happened too. People changed. The same neighbors who once looked down at the sidewalk when passing others now nodded, stopped, shared coffee and quiet words of thanks. I saw fences come down, literally and metaphorically. Where once there had been suspicion and fear, there was now solidarity. A local reporter picked up the story and ran a piece titled, "The Judge Who Took Down the HOA." Within days, national media picked it up. Our quiet, tree-lined neighborhood became a symbol of what happens when unchecked authority meets the steady resolve of someone who remembers what justice is supposed to feel like. Eventually, under pressure from the city, the HOA was formally dissolved and replaced with a resident-led council, a transparent, accountable committee where decisions were made publicly and power was shared. Sharon resigned from her board seat and vanished. Some said she moved in with family across the state. Others claimed she left the country. I didn't care where she went. What mattered to me was that when Ellie and Max rode their bikes again, this time grinning from ear to ear, I saw no fear in their eyes, only freedom. One afternoon, Max asked, "Dad, do you think it'll ever happen again?" I looked around, at the neighbors mowing lawns, walking dogs, waving as they passed. "Not if we remember what it felt like," I said. "That was the point, wasn't it? Not just to win, but to make sure no one else would ever go through what we did." We held a small gathering in the newly opened park, the one that used to have a residents-only sign nailed to a chain-link fence. I stood quietly near the back, watching Ellie help a younger kid climb onto the swing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not because I'd fought back, but because others had joined me. Because dignity had been restored not by force, but by truth. And just when I thought it was all behind us, a sealed envelope arrived in my mailbox, with no return address, no stamp, just my name in neat cursive writing. And what I found inside changed everything. The envelope sat on my kitchen table for almost an hour before I opened it. There was something about the way it was written, deliberate, clean cursive, no return address, just Judge Caldwell in ink that looked too formal to ignore. When I finally slid it open, I found a handwritten note on ivory stationery. "You didn't just embarrass me," it read. "You destroyed me. I hope you're proud." No signature, no explanation. But I didn't need one. I folded the letter and slid it into a drawer. Not out of fear, but out of closure. There was nothing left to say. Sharon's reign had ended not in a courtroom, but in the quiet unraveling of her own lies. Still, her words lingered, not because they hurt, but because they showed how deeply someone could believe they were the victim, even after all they'd done. Over the following weeks, life slowly settled into something resembling normal. Ellie and Max started sleeping through the night again. They laughed louder, ran farther, drew chalk murals on the driveway without glancing over their shoulders. I saw how much they'd carried in those days when fear moved in like a shadow, and I thanked God for their resilience, the kind only children seem to hold with such grace. Neighbors who once walked past in silence now stopped to talk, to say thank you, to admit they'd been afraid too. One man, Steve from 3 doors down, told me he'd once been fined $300 for having a basketball hoop. He never pushed back because, as he put it, people like me don't win against people like her. But the truth is, people do win when they stop waiting to be invited to stand up. The community shifted. People began helping each other with yard work, organizing potlucks, even starting a neighborhood watch, not to police, but to protect. It reminded me of my childhood, where backyards blurred together and screen doors stayed open. There was something beautiful about watching dignity return, not through force, but through shared experience. The kids in the neighborhood, once quiet and tucked away indoors, began forming little bike gangs again. just the sound of laughter and tires buzzing on sidewalk concrete. One afternoon, Ellie taped a note to her handlebars that said, "Free to ride." I didn't say a word, but I took a picture, printed it, and framed it for my desk. At work, colleagues had caught wind of the story. Some joked, calling me the HOA slayer. Others offered quiet words of support. But none of it mattered as much as the message I got from a former client, someone I'd sentenced 10 years earlier who had turned his life around. "You always said justice was about more than punishment," he wrote. "Now I get it. That meant more to me than any headline." In time, the legal case we'd filed reached settlement. No trial. The former board paid damages, some out of pocket, some from what remained of the HOA's coffers. We donated most of it to a local non-profit that supports families dealing with housing harassment. Max suggested the name. He called it the Sidewalk Project. I don't think he even realized how poetic that was. Ellie and Max still ask questions sometimes. Why did she hate us? What if you weren't a judge? Would we still be stuck? I try to answer honestly. I tell them that some people confuse power with purpose, and when they feel small inside, they make others feel smaller to hide it. I remind them that standing up doesn't require a robe or a title. It just requires knowing who you are and what you won't allow. Most nights now I read to them before bed. Stories about courage, about ordinary people who did the right thing even when it was hard. They like the ones with dragons and swords, but I think the stories that matter most are the ones where someone simply says no. No to fear, no to injustice, no to silence. In the end, I didn't set out to be a hero. I was a dad making pancakes. I was a man who wanted peace. But sometimes peace comes only after the storm, after you face down the thing that tried to steal your quiet and show it that you're not afraid. People assume judges live above the noise, that we're immune to the mess of real life. But the truth is, the robe doesn't make you stronger. It's what you're willing to do when it comes off. That summer changed me. Not because of what I lost, but because of what I found. Courage in unexpected places, strength in my children's eyes, and a community that finally remembered its own voice. I've presided over hundreds of cases in my life. I've handed down sentences, watched families break and rebuild. But nothing taught me more about justice than watching my kids pedal down the street with the wind in their hair and no fear in their hearts. Because in the end, justice isn't always about courts or verdicts. Sometimes it's simply making sure the people you love are safe, seen, and free. And for me, that's enough. That's everything. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. True justice doesn't always wear a robe, carry a badge, or sit in a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like a father standing firm when no one else will. It sounds like a child laughing again after fear is finally gone. And it feels like dignity, earned, reclaimed, and protected. We can't always control what power others try to take, but we can control how we rise when it's tested. And when you stand for what's right, not just for yourself, but for those you love, you don't just win, you leave a legacy. If this story moved you, if you believe in standing up for respect, truth, and family, then take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on the bell notification so you never miss the stories that matter. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we stand for something.